Blood does not stay red. Within days, it oxidizes to brown. Within years, it turns black. That is not belief. That is chemistry, and chemistry does not care what you were hoping to find. Iron in the haemoglobin oxidizes, the structure breaks down, and the color dies with it. Every forensic scientist knows this. Every mortician knows this. It is one of the most reliable transformations in the natural world. And yet, on a strip of linen kept in a cathedral in northern Italy, there are stains that people have believed for centuries to be blood. That linen is old. Nobody argues about that. The stains have been sitting on those fibers through summers and winters, fires and floods, for longer than most nations have existed. By every rule we just described, those stains should be black, uniformly, boringly black. Under a microscope, particles of them are still red. Not brown, not a faded rust, red. And when two chemists in the late 1970s finally sat down to work out why this blood on this cloth broke a rule that blood does not break, the answer they arrived at was, in a strange way, worse than a forgery. Because the explanation they reached did not describe a painter. It described a man who had been hurt in a very specific way, close to the outer limit of what a human body can endure and still bleed the way this cloth records. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to look at that red very differently. Not because I am going to tell you what you are allowed to believe, but because the chemistry is stranger, and the honest fight around it is stranger still, than the version most people have heard. If long, patient investigations into objects the mainstream world thought it had already filed away are the kind of thing you find yourself unable to stop watching, you already know where you are. So let us do this one properly. First, let us understand exactly what we are talking about, not the theology, the physical object. The Shroud of Turin is a single piece of linen cloth. It is long, a little over 4 meters, and roughly 1 meter wide, woven in a herringbone twill pattern that is itself a small point of argument, but set that aside for now. Faintly, across its length, there is the image of a man, front and back, head to head, as though a body had been laid on one half and the other half folded over the top. The image is faint. Up close, it almost disappears. It resolves best from a distance. The man appears to have been beaten, scourged across the back and legs, wounded at the wrists and feet, and pierced in the side. Whatever else is true about this cloth, that wound pattern is not vague. It is detailed, and it is consistent with a specific and brutal form of execution. The cloth is kept in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin. It is owned since 1983 by the Holy See. For most of its documented life, it belonged to the House of Savoy. It is stored flat now in an airtight case, under inert gas and controlled light, because it has already survived more than one fire and nobody intends to lose it to the next one. That is the object. Cloth, image, wounds, custody. Here is the hairline crack. The image, faint as it is one mystery. How it got there, whether it was painted, scorched, or formed some other way, is a fight all its own. But the stains are a separate question, because the image and the apparent blood stains behave differently on the cloth. And it was the stains, not the image, that two men were finally allowed to put under real instruments. So let us talk about how that happened, because the circumstances matter more than people usually realize. In October of 1978, for 5 days, a team of American scientists were given direct access to the shroud. They called themselves the Shroud of Turin Research Project, STURP for short. Physicists, chemists, imaging specialists, most of them with day jobs at serious institutions and national laboratories. They brought spectrometers, microscopes, X-ray equipment, ultraviolet, and infrared photography. They were not permitted to cut the cloth. What they were permitted to do was take sticky tape samples, pressing adhesive tape onto the surface and lifting off whatever fibers and particles came with it, and to run non-destructive scans across the fabric itself. Two of the people who ended up with those tape samples were John Heller and Alan Adler. Heller was a physician and a biophysicist. Adler was a chemist, and here's the detail that turns out to matter enormously. Adler was a specialist in porphyrins. Porphyrins are the ring-shaped molecules at the heart of hemoglobin, the very chemistry that makes blood red and then, over time, makes it stop being red. Of all the people to hand a set of tape lifts covered in mysterious reddish particles, a porphyrin chemist is close to the ideal. Adler did not need the blood to be blood. He needed to find out what the particles actually were. Now, before we get to what they found, understand what the safe, boring expected answer would have been. The expected answer was paint, a red pigment, iron oxide, ochre, vermilion, applied by a medieval artist to fake the appearance of blood. That is not a wild theory. It is the default. It is what a careful scientist should suspect first. And one microscopist involved in the wider study of the cloth, Walter McCrone, argued exactly that the red he saw was consistent with pigment, with iron oxide and traces of vermilion, and that the whole thing was, in the end, a painting. Hold on to McCrone. he does not go away. So Heller and Adler ran their tests, and this is the investigation that produced the results that reopened the room. They found haemoglobin. They found the spectral signature of it in the reddish particles under multiple methods. They found albumin, the most abundant protein in blood serum. They ran tests for the presence of protein at all, and the stained areas responded. The image? Only areas did not. They found bile pigments. They reported evidence of the breakdown products of hemoglobin, the exact molecules a chemist would expect if blood had degraded, but not the way ordinary blood degrades. That distinction is the whole story, so slow down here. Adler was not just finding blood. He was finding blood that had gone through an unusual chemical process. Ordinary blood, spilled and dried, becomes ordinary brown to black hematine. What Adler reported on the shroud fibers was different. A high proportion of methemoglobin in an unusually stable acid form, sitting alongside an unusually high concentration of one specific compound, bilirubin. Pause on that word for a moment, because it is the load-bearing beam of this entire case. Bilirubin is what your body makes when it breaks down red blood cells. Old cells die, hemoglobin is recycled, and one of the byproducts is bilirubin, a yellow-orange pigment. In small amounts, it is completely normal. Your liver processes it and moves it out. You have heard of it without knowing it. When a newborn goes yellow with jaundice, that is bilirubin. When a bruise turns that sickly yellow-green as it heals, that is bilirubin, at the surface, in real time. So the presence of some bilirubin is not strange. The amount Adler reported is what stopped people. Because here is the mechanism. When a body is subjected to severe, sustained physical trauma, crushing, beating, deep muscle injury, shock, red blood cells rupture inside the body on a massive scale. That is called hemolysis. The liver, flooded, converts the wreckage into bilirubin faster than it can clear it, and the bilirubin level in the blood climbs. A person under extreme torture does not just bleed. Their blood chemistry changes. The circulating blood itself becomes loaded with bilirubin, and bilirubin is orange-red. This is Adler's explanation, and it is worth stating plainly because it is elegant. Blood that is high in bilirubin and high in this stable met form of hemoglobin does not brown and blacken the way ordinary blood does. The mix holds a red-orange color. The very thing that should have made the stains impossible, their redness centuries on, is, on this reading, not evidence that the blood is fake. It is evidence about the state of the person the blood came from. That alone should make you pause. But it does not stop there, because now you have to read that chemistry against the cloth it is sitting on. And this is where the two independent lines start pointing at the same thing. Line 1 is the chemistry, blood loaded with bilirubin, consistent with a body in severe traumatic shock and mass hemolysis. Line 2 is the image itself, studied separately by different people for different reasons. A wound pattern showing scourging across the back and legs, puncture wounds at the wrists and the feet, a large wound in the side, and marks around the scalp. A pattern, in other words, of a beating and an execution that would cause exactly the kind of catastrophic whole-body trauma that drives bilirubin up in the first place. 2 lines of evidence, one from a chemist looking at particles under a spectrometer, one from imaging specialists looking at wound geometry across a cloth, neither depending on the other, and they converge on the same picture, not a painter's idea of suffering, but the chemical and physical residue of the real thing. This is not a supernatural claim. I want to be very clear about that. Nothing we have said so far requires anything miraculous. It requires only that these stains are, in fact, blood, and that the blood came from a genuinely, extremely injured human being. That is a claim about chemistry and about wounds, nothing more, which raises the obvious question, and it is the right one to ask. Is the blood even human? Here is where the honesty has to come in, because this is a live argument, and pretending otherwise would insult you. An Italian forensic pathologist at the University of Turin, Pierluigi Baima Bologna, examined material from the shroud and reported that the blood was human and that it belonged to blood group AB. That claim has been repeated for decades, and for a lot of people, it sits at the emotional center of the case. Human blood, a specific group. Suddenly, it is not an abstraction. It is a person with a body and a blood type. And here is the counter case, delivered straight, because it deserves to be. Typing blood from a very old, very degraded sample is genuinely unreliable. Immunological reviewers have pointed out, correctly, that as blood ages and breaks down, the tests used to determine blood group become prone to false results, and that aged or contaminated samples very often return AB regardless of what the original group was. AB is, in effect, the answer degraded samples like to give. So a reported result of AB from centuries-old material is not the clean confirmation it sounds like. It might be right, it might be an artifact of decay. On the current evidence, you cannot force that door shut in either direction. And there's a harder version of the skeptical position. And we already met the man who made it. Walter Macrone never accepted that the red was blood at all. He argued it was pigment, iron oxide, with vermilion, the ordinary materials of a medieval workshop. Heller and Adler rejected that. They said their spectral and chemical tests were finding hemoglobin and its byproducts, not paint. Macrone said they were finding what they wanted. That fight was real, it was bitter, and it never fully resolved. You're allowed to find Adler's chemistry persuasive. You're also allowed to notice that a serious microscopist looked at the same cloth and saw a painting. So where does that leave us? With a stain that behaves chemically like trauma, and a running argument about whether it is even blood, and if it is, whose kind. Now, let us talk about the carbon dating, because this is the single biggest fight in this channel's own comment section, and I am going to give it to you from both sides with no thumb on the scale. In 1988, a small sample was cut from one corner of the shroud and divided between 3 independent laboratories: Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona, radiocarbon dating. The result came back, and it was published in the journal Nature, and it was blunt. The linen dated to somewhere between roughly 1260 and 1390 of the Common Era. Medieval, not ancient. If that number stands, the story we have just built has a serious problem, because a cloth woven in the 13th or 14th century cannot have wrapped a body that, on the traditional reading, died in the first. The trauma chemistry could be real, and the cloth could still be medieval, the work of someone somehow laying real and horribly injured blood onto a later cloth. But the simplest reading of 1988 is, this is a medieval object, full stop, and everything else is enthusiasm. That is the mainstream scientific position, and it is held for more than 30 years. It is not a fringe view, it is the default view. You should know that, and you should weigh it. Now here is the other side, and it is not nothing. Ray Rogers was a chemist from Los Alamos, one of the original STURP members. He was, by temperament, a skeptic. He expected the dating to confirm a medieval origin, and he was comfortable with that. Then he actually studied the physical sample that had been cut. And Rogers argued something specific, that the corner the labs sampled was not representative of the main cloth, that it fell in an area that had been mended, a skilled, near-invisible repair, the kind that textile conservators call an interwoven or French reweave, in which newer thread had been worked into the old to patch damage. He pointed to the presence of cotton and dye in that region that did not match the main body of the linen, and to differences in a compound called vanillin, which fades from linen over centuries at a rate you can, roughly, read like a clock. On Rogers' reading, the labs had, in good faith, dated a patch. That is the reweave argument, and it splits the room. Because the radiocarbon community pushed back hard, and their pushback is also serious, they point out that the 3 labs handled and cleaned the sample carefully. They point out that no clear physical evidence of a large-scale reweave was noted in the radiocarbon sample at the time of cutting. They argue that a repair extensive enough to shift the date from the 1st century to the 14th would have to be enormous and would be difficult to hide even from the naked eye, let alone from the people who examined the thread. To them, the reweave hypothesis looks like a way of explaining away a result somebody did not like. And the Shroud researchers answer that the whole point of an expert reweave is that it is meant not to be seen, that the sampled corner was exactly the kind of handled, damaged edge most likely to have been repaired, and that the vanillin and material differences are real data, not wishful thinking. I am not going to pretend to settle that for you. I am not qualified to, and neither, honestly, is anyone shouting about it in a comment section. What I can tell you is that both sides are landing real punches. One side has a published, replicated radiocarbon result in a top journal. The other side has a physical chemistry argument about sampling that has never been fully put to rest, because it can only be truly resolved one way. And that brings us to the quietest, and in some ways the most frustrating part of this entire story. There is a clean way to end the argument. You take a fresh sample, a small one, from an undisputed area of the main cloth, not the handled corner, not the region Rogers flagged, somewhere central, somewhere nobody claims was ever repaired. You divide it among independent labs, using the best modern radiocarbon methods far more refined than what existed in 1988. And you see what comes back. If it comes back medieval again, the reweave argument largely collapses. And the honest conclusion is that this is a remarkable medieval object with genuinely puzzling blood chemistry. If it comes back ancient, then 1988 was measuring a patch, and everything reopens. That test has not been permitted. Think about how strange that really is for a second. Here is one of the most studied objects on Earth, at the center of a decades-long fight that a single well-designed sampling could largely resolve, and the definitive retest simply has not happened. The custodians have not authorized new radiocarbon cutting. Proposals have been made, they have not been approved. And so the object sits in its sealed case under inert gas, holding its answer, while everyone argues around it. Now step back and look at the full picture. What we are left with, after decades of investigation, is a strange and stubborn convergence that refuses to fully resolve. We have reddish stains that, by ordinary chemistry, should long ago have gone black. We have two chemists, one of them a porphyrin specialist, reporting haemoglobin, albumin, blood breakdown products, and an unusual load of bilirubin, the specific chemical signature of a body driven into massive trauma. We have a wound pattern, studied separately, that matches exactly the kind of injuries that would produce that chemistry. We have a blood group claim that might be real and might be the artifact of decay. We have a skeptical microscopist who never stopped calling it paint. We have a radiocarbon result that says medieval, and a reweave argument that says the radiocarbon sampled the wrong thread, and no one willing to cut the clean sample that would tell us who is right. Every one of these elements can be challenged individually. The bilirubin can be questioned. The typing can be questioned. The dating can be questioned. The reweave can be questioned. Any single thread, pulled on its own, phrase. But all of them together, blood that behaves like trauma, on a cloth nobody can date to everyone's satisfaction, guarded from the one test that would end the debate. That is a different kind of question. And honestly, that is part of why this case will not lie still. It is not that the mystery is unanswerable. It is that the answer is reachable, and no one has been willing to reach for it. So here is what I keep coming back to. Strip away the belief, strip away the doubt, and you are left with a physical object that seems to remember something the way a wound remembers. Red, where it should be black, chemistry that reads like pain, and a room full of very smart people who cannot agree, in part because they have not been allowed to finish looking. If you have made it this far, you are the kind of person this channel is built for. So consider subscribing, because there are far more of these than most people realize. And I want to hear from you. Which piece of this unsettled you most? The bilirubin, the blood group, the medieval date, or the reweave? Tell me in the comments, and tell me honestly, because the disagreement is half the point. This is not the only object like this. There are others. Some of them are sitting in display cases right now, cataloged, labeled, dated, and quietly waiting for someone to point a better instrument at them and get back an answer nobody was ready for. We are still working through the list. I'll see you in the next one.